So my name's Ben O'Neill, and today I'm going to be discussing something I call the anti-discrimination paradigm. This is based on a few papers I've written, and so if you're interested in the topic and want more information on it than I can give you in 40 or 50 minutes, I have written things on this that I'm happy to direct you to. As you can see from the title, it won't be a very flattering description of this paradigm, but I will get into that shortly. Okay, so when I talk about the anti-discrimination paradigm, what I mean here is the set of philosophical and political ideas that, broadly speaking, tell us discrimination is bad. Just put that where I can see it. Now, we're usually told that discrimination on particular grounds is bad, and commonly verboten characteristics for discrimination are things like sex, race, age, sometimes sexuality, pregnancy status or marital status, disability, religion. Sometimes you'll find arguments against discrimination on the basis of political affiliations, union membership, looks, attractiveness, all sorts of things like this. And in general, as I'll be arguing later, there doesn't seem to be a clearly defined or rational limiting principle to this kind of paradigm. In general, what it says is that discrimination per se is bad. These are just some banners from various anti-discrimination activist groups and legal enforcement groups talking about discrimination. As you can see, the general theme that runs through them is a general message that discrimination per se is bad rather than particular types of discrimination. You've got a lot of banners saying stop discrimination now, speak up, stop discrimination. The one in the middle is probably most encompasses the general thrust of the anti-discrimination paradigm, which is to say discrimination of any kind is wrong, and they mean presumably morally and logically wrong. So to test this idea, I'm going to have a look at a kind of decision and discrimination problem and talk about it from my perspective as a statistician. So imagine that we are in some situation where we have a decision to make pertaining to another person. So it could be a decision of whether you'll hire a person for employment purposes, whether you'll date a certain person, if you're a taxi driver perhaps, whether you'll pick that person up in your taxi, whether you feel comfortable leaving your belongings in the safekeeping of another person, or any other decision problem where you have alternative actions open to you and that decision problem pertains to another person. Now, I'm going to assume in this case and stipulate that your goal in this decision problem is some morally acceptable goal. Now obviously if that's not the case, then we have other problems aside from whatever discrimination you might engage in to reach that goal. So we're going to imagine a situation where you're facing a decision problem where the goal is accepted by all of us broadly as being a morally legitimate goal to try to achieve. And an example I'm going to use is, I think this is quite a good example. It's taken from a 1989 paper by a place called the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law, which sounds terrifying. They wrote a paper, basically this was an anti-discrimination activist group who were concerned about discrimination against black men in the provision of taxi service in Washington, DC. And they conducted a study in 1989 which they said showed that taxi drivers were less likely to pick up black men in general and young black men in particular than other demographic groups. They had less probability of being picked up in a taxi under similar circumstances. And similarly, they also found that taxi drivers were less likely to agree to drive passengers of any race to areas of the city with larger proportions of the black population, which also happen to be higher crime and higher poverty areas. So this is an actual example of a controversial issue that's come up in the past. Now we're going to imagine putting ourselves in the perspective of the taxi driver, and he's driving around the city, perhaps Washington DC, perhaps some similar city, looking for fares, and he sees a young black man signal for his taxi to stop, and he's faced with this decision problem of will he stop and let this guy in, or will he ignore him and keep driving and look for another passenger? Now his goal here is the morally acceptable goal to try to get a taxi fare from someone and at the same time avoid the danger of being assaulted or robbed or killed or whatever. Okay, so avoid the danger of some kind of violent attack. Now, he knows, let's suppose, from various sources of information that young black males, so people of the same demographic group as this guy waving down his taxi, are a high-risk demographic group in the sense that there's a higher proportion of violent crime among that group, just as an empirical matter. Now, we might, to see how he should make this decision, logically speaking, we might look at the various characteristics of the person he's dealing with and divide that into 4 different groups according to 2 different categorizations. First of all, there's things that the taxi driver can observe about this person and things that he cannot observe. Excuse me. So observed things are the fact that this guy is waving for a taxi. He can also observe the race, sex and approximate age of the person based on seeing him at the side of the road, what clothing he's wearing, maybe a little bit about his activity, his posture, how he's standing, what kind of activity he's doing, if he's holding anything, if he looks agitated or not, and anything that he can glean essentially in the 10, 15, 20 seconds that he has to decide whether to stop or keep driving. So that's the column of observed characteristics. Unobserved characteristics is every other characteristic of this person that the taxi driver can't see. So whether or not the guy actually has taxi fare with him or some capacity to pay taxi fare, whether or not the person has an intention to pay the taxi fare as opposed to an intention to assault and rob the driver, what his favourite breakfast cereal is, what his cousin's middle name is, who was his 3rd grade English teacher, any other characteristic of the person that the taxi driver is not privy to. The person waving for the taxi, by the way, knows all this information, but the taxi driver does not. Now, if we look at these 4 categories of information, we'll start with the bottom right category, the unobserved non-merit characteristics. Actually, before I even get to that, I should explain what I mean by merit and non-merit characteristics. I've divided the rows into what I call merit characteristics, which are those characteristics that directly pertain to the goal that the taxi driver is trying to achieve. So anything on that row, that top row, is something that has a direct bearing on what is the best decision that the taxi driver ought to make. Should he stop and pick this guy up, or should he keep driving? So here we have the fact that the guy is waving for a taxi, which indicates that he wants to go in the taxi and get somewhere, whether or not he has taxi fare, whether or not he has an intention to pay. All of those things bear directly on the goal of trying to get a taxi fare and trying to avoid assault. Okay, the things on the other row, the non-merit characteristics, are any characteristics which don't directly bear on that goal. Okay? And so what we mean when we talk about merits versus non-merits is things that either do or don't have a direct bearing on the goal that's trying to be achieved. Okay? So let's have a look at this bottom right category. This category of information is completely irrelevant to the decision. Now, on the one hand, these are unobserved characteristics, which means that the taxi driver can't use them in his decision because he doesn't know what they are. And on the other hand, they're also non-merit characteristics, meaning that they have no bearing on his goal, and hence there is no need for him to try and guess what they are or make any inference about what they are. So they're both incapable of being used in the decision and also irrelevant in assessment terms in trying to make a good decision, and hence they're irrelevant overall. Above that, in this top right category, we have unobserved merit characteristics. These are relevant insofar as they affect the goodness or badness of a particular decision, but on the other hand, they're unobserved, so the taxi driver cannot use that information to make his decision. Therefore, he needs to infer what those characteristics are or make a good guess. I sometimes tell my students when I'm teaching statistics that statistical inference is the art of good guessing. Well, that's what this guy has to do. He needs to guess what these characteristics are. Now, in order to do that, he has 2 categories of observed information, these 2 on the left-hand column. And this is what he can use to try to make inference into that category in the yellow. Okay? So from a statistical inference point of view, this is the setup of a discrimination problem. We have relevant information in the yellow area there, and the taxi driver has to use the information in the orange columns to try to infer that. Now, this leads us to a particular kind of discrimination, which I'll call rational discrimination, because I will argue that it's a rational kind of discrimination to make. And to explain this, I'm going to designate those categories with letters. Forgive me, I'm a mathematician, so because I'll be referring to these things over and over again, I don't want to have to talk about non-merit observed characteristics every time. So we're going to designate these with letters. We're going to call X and Y our merit characteristics, X being the observed, Y being the unobserved, and we're going to refer to our observed non-merit characteristics as R. You can think of R for race, perhaps. So if we go back and have a look at these categories, in the case of this taxi driver, race falls into the category of observed non-merit characteristics. So you can think of R for race, although that's certainly not the only characteristic there. Okay. Now that fourth category, obviously, we've already said is irrelevant. So these are the three categories of interest. Now, the best decision for this taxi driver is going to depend on those categories X and Y. Those are the merit characteristics, the characteristics that directly affect the goal he's trying to obtain. But he doesn't know why. Okay? And that leads him to this inferential setup where he attempts to use the things that he does know, categories X and R, to guess or infer category Y and get the best guess that he possibly can. And so from a statistical point of view, this is essentially the inference problem that someone in this situation is faced with. Now, by looking at the principles of statistical inference and then some later moral principles analysing that, we can figure out various principles of rational discrimination that tell us how that decision ought to be made from a logical point of view and what kinds of factors are relevant or irrelevant to that decision. So the first principle I want to look at is just the general principle of when it is rational to use observed non-merit characteristics, such as in that example, race, sex, age, etc., to discriminate. By discriminate, I mean this guy is going to take a decision. He will take decision A if this guy is a young black male, but he would have taken decision B if instead the would-be passenger was an 82-year-old white woman with a walking frame. Okay, so I mean he's going to take a different decision depending on the characteristic he observes. So he's discriminating in his assessment and his action. Now, statistical inference tells us that when this should occur is when R, category R, is a valid predictor of category Y, conditional on any other information that this guy has. And in this case, the other information is everything in category X. And this occurs when there is a statistical or empirical relationship between Y and R conditional on knowledge of X. And what I mean by that is, suppose this taxi driver knows that even after he takes account of who's waiting for a taxi cab, which is his other information, he knows that there's a statistical, empirical, positive correlation between race and crime. He knows, for example, that young black males commit a higher proportion of violent crimes in that city, so that there's positive correlation between traits like being a male and committing violent crime, being young as in young adult and committing violent crime, being black and committing violent crime. And this need only be a statistical empirical correlation. As I'll talk about later, we don't have to assume any causal link there. So all that's necessary for this kind of discrimination to be rational is that one is a good predictor or proxy for the other in the absence of more direct knowledge. So this is what the science of statistical inference tells us to look for in making that kind of judgment. And so it establishes this category of rational discrimination on the grounds of things like race and sex and age and things that we have been told are characteristics that you should never use for discriminatory purposes. Statistical inference tells us different. Now, a very important part of this is a principle that I call causal irrelevance. Okay? For the purposes of deciding whether it is rational in that case to discriminate on the basis of sex, age, race, etc., what is relevant is whether those things are correlated, statistically speaking, empirically speaking, with the things of interest, whether the guy is going to commit violent crime or not. It is not relevant what the particular causal connections between those things are. Okay? So it may be the case that characteristics in R cause characteristics in Y, or maybe characteristics in Y cause characteristics in R, or maybe they have some mutual common cause, or maybe they're related less directly than that even, through just more tenuous relationships with other covariates. What matters from the point of view of rational discrimination in this kind of passive predictive sense is whether the things are empirically related, not whether they are causally related. Incidentally, where causal relationships start becoming relevant is when you want to know the effect of an action, an intervening action you're going to take to interfere with the situation. Okay? So if you had the capacity to interfere with the situation and change some of the characteristics somehow, then you would need to know the causal links in order to know what effect that would have. But if you're simply taking a predictive inference where you sit back, you don't intervene, and you're just trying to guess Y from R, what matters is just correlation. Okay? Now, this actually gives us a bit of insight into the relationship between race discrimination and racism. Okay? Now, again, a lot of the anti-discrimination paradigm will tend to suggest that all instances of race discrimination are proof of racism. Okay? But actually, the causal irrelevance principle tells us that this is not the case. It tells us that if race is a direct cause of the characteristics in Y, then obviously we would expect it to also be correlated with Y and therefore give information about Y and therefore be used for discrimination. But that is not a necessary condition. It's certainly a sufficient condition for discrimination, but not a necessary condition. Now, if we regard racism as the thesis, if you like, that belief and behaviour of a person is genetically determined and therefore follows along racial lines, then if we believed that thesis to be true, for example, under the kind of eugenicist idea that black people are genetically predisposed to crime, if you subscribed to that view, obviously it would make sense to discriminate because you think there's a direct causal link, therefore there would be correlation, and therefore race would be a good predictor of crime. But it's certainly not necessary to take that view, and in fact, if you believe, as I do, that that is a false thesis, there are still many instances in which it is nonetheless rational to race discriminate in those kinds of situations because race can nonetheless be a good predictor of other things. Incidentally, I talk a lot about race discrimination in these cases. Understand that broadly speaking that applies to any non-merit characteristic. The reason I use race is that that is probably the characteristic where it is most firmly entrenched as a kind of verboten characteristic. So if I can make my case on that, I think that it's also probably demonstrating that sex discrimination, age discrimination, and those things can be rational in the kinds of circumstances I'm talking about as well. And so what we find is then that although racism is a sufficient condition for race discrimination, it's certainly not a necessary condition. One can not be a racist and yet find instances of rational race discrimination. How might you differentiate these things? Okay, one objection you hear is, okay, well, sure, they might be different, but if you see the taxi driver not give this young black guy a lift, he just drives straight past, how do you know if he's a racist or not? How do you know whether he is doing that because he just thinks these things are predictive of one another, or whether he's doing that because he believes that young black males are genetically predisposed to commit crime? How can you tell the difference when you're only seeing the outcome? The way that you can tell the difference between a causal thesis leading to correlation and belief in correlation due to something else is by looking at the effect of gaining more information. If we believe, again correctly in my view, that racism is a false thesis and that there is no direct causal link there, then what we would expect is that as we start to gain more and more direct information about the person, if, for example, you think, okay, the real causal factor isn't race, it's poverty, for example, and that it just happens that race is correlated with poverty and crime is correlated with poverty, and it's that mutual correlation that's causing the correlation between race and crime. If that was your causal belief, then it would stand to reason that once you gain more direct information about the poverty or lack of poverty of the person, then race is no longer useful as a proxy characteristic to predict crime. That conditional on that new information, the correlation between race and crime then drops to zero, and it's no longer useful and no longer able to be used for rational discrimination. So rational discrimination in the kinds of situations that I've set out there, for example, the taxi driver, will tend to be something that arises in discrimination problems where the decision maker has very small capacity for getting much information about the person. In the case of the taxi driver, he just isn't in a situation to be able to find out more about this guy prior to letting him into the cab when he's already exposing himself to danger. But if we're in situations where you can obtain more direct information, if there's no causal link between those things, you would expect the relevance of that characteristic to diminish. Now, principle 3 of rational discrimination is that there is no reason to expect equal representation between groups under rational decision making about them. Regardless of whether discrimination is occurring in taxi service, there is no reason to expect that young black males will be equally represented as taxi passengers compared to another demographic group, okay? In proportion to the population or whatever. Now, some people take this view, and in fact a lot of people that advocate the anti-discrimination paradigm take the view that they expect equal proportional representation according to demographic groups. There's actually no reason to expect that. There's two reasons why we wouldn't expect it to happen. One is obviously if discrimination does take place, including if it's rational discrimination, then that is a reason that we might see unequal outcomes. But even absent discrimination, it is quite possible that there may be a correlation between the non-merit characteristics and the observed merit characteristics. So, for example, even if taxi drivers eschew race and sex and age discrimination in that case and just pick up everyone who flags a taxi, there's no reason to believe that every demographic group uses taxis equally. It may be, for example, that there's more taxis around the CBD than in more regional areas, and therefore businessmen are the people most commonly getting taxis, or businesswomen who happen to be around the CBD and high taxi areas, and therefore you would expect inequality in representation in taxi fares. The fourth principle is that there is no reason to interpret discrimination of this kind as being demeaning to the person to whom it's directed. Remember, this is an inference, okay? The taxi driver, if, for example, he drives past this fellow because he decides that he's too high risk, that demographic group is just too high risk based on the information he has, that inference means what it means and nothing more. He is not saying to this guy, you are a criminal. He's saying to him, I don't know if you're a criminal. I only have very limited information about you. What I do know is that based on what I can see, you are in a high-risk group. And he's correct about that. And so this shouldn't be taken as something which implies that the person being turned down for a taxi fare, for example, is a bad or unworthy person. That shouldn't be read into the taxi driver's decision. There's nothing inherently demeaning about that decision. And finally, it is a morally legitimate decision. I've so far focused on the rationality of this decision in terms of statistical inference. If we accept the view that justice and moral conduct towards other people means treating them rationally as we can, given the information available, then it immediately implies that logical, rational action like that must therefore be moral. Okay? We're in a situation where we're accepting that this guy has a morally acceptable goal and that he is using proper inferential techniques to make the best guess he can to achieve that goal. If we have no objection to the goal of getting taxi fare and avoiding assault, and we can establish that it is rational to discriminate on certain grounds to do that, then it is senseless to say that it is immoral to engage in that discrimination. This, by the way, is probably the big thing that anti-discrimination activists reject. Quite often they will accept that there is such a thing as rational discrimination of the kind I've described, and they'll describe it as rational but immoral discrimination. And I don't think people fully appreciate how radical a view that is compared to the kind of history of philosophy of what justice is. Classically speaking, justice has always been regarded as an application of reason to human affairs, an application of rational decision-making about others. So to say that a piece of conduct can be both rational and immoral really totally obliterates what we've always classically understood morality to be. Incidentally, this also has bad consequences. You might think, all right, well, what's the harm if he does pick up the guy? Most young black males, a vast majority, are not going to beat up this taxi driver. So obviously, if he doesn't discriminate, he's going to get a whole lot of extra taxi fares that he wouldn't have got otherwise, and the vast majority of those will not assault him. Okay? And that's true. So there are a lot, if he does discriminate, he's going to get a lot of false positives and he's going to lose a lot of taxi fares. But he's also going to avoid the occasional guy that would have beaten him up. And the question from a rationality point of view is weighing off the risk of those two bad outcomes and the consequences of those bad outcomes. Now, in this case, the consequence of losing a taxi fare is quite minor. The consequences of getting beaten up and robbed are quite major, and so he will err on the side of greater caution, eschewing high-risk demographic groups, even though he knows probably 99% of them, or more even, will just pay for the taxi and be perfectly fine. So there are actually bad consequences to a failure to rationally discriminate. And I want to go further than that. Not only is it morally legitimate to engage in this kind of rational discrimination, if we accept the view that morality is simply a species of the rational, then it is immoral not to engage in race, sex, age discrimination, etc. Because by doing so, we are refusing to apply relevant and available information to get the best guess we can about the individual merits of a person. Okay? And although in this case that will lead this guy to a lot of false positives, it's also going to lead him to greater invitation to people who are actually going to beat him up. All right? Okay. So now I'll just finish off. How much time have I got, Washington? 25 minutes. Oh, wonderful. All right, so now having established some of the principles of rational discrimination through looking at what statistical inference tells us about how to make those kinds of decisions, I want to look at ways in which the anti-discrimination paradigm undermines rational principles about decision making and ways in which it takes contrary views on these things incorrectly. Incidentally, you'll find misunderstanding on most of those principles I've described running through a lot of anti-discrimination literature. Not every person makes every mistake. Some anti-discrimination activists are correct in some of those principles and incorrectly apply others, but there's a general confusion on most of them, so we're going to have a look at a few aspects of that. Expand to things like pregnancy, which is a chosen state, marital status, which is a chosen state. You can become married, you can become unmarried. And so clearly the initial advocacy that this was the principle, that it's unchosen and unchangeable characteristics, that's now been violated and things have expanded beyond that ambit. Another thing that's been put forward as a possible rationalising and limiting principle is the idea that we will only prohibit discrimination on the basis of things that have no causal bearing on anything. And yet we see instances of anti-discrimination law, for example, to avoid discrimination against people with disabilities in various cases, even when those disabilities directly impact on their capacity to do various things. Now, I'm not saying it's necessarily rational or irrational to discriminate in those cases. It'll depend on the situation. The point is that the limiting principle advocated as a kind of justification for anti-discrimination law is then breached by the expansion of further and further categories of things that we're not allowed to use. Incidentally, there does not appear to be any limit to the ways in which those things will expand. There has never been a rational or accepted limiting principle which would stop that paradigm at some point and say, okay, these kinds of discrimination are the things we're trying to stop. And so when you look at the conjunction of both those explicit statements and the expansion of the laws into various different kinds of characteristics, you see quite clearly that they really do mean it. When they say discrimination of all kinds is wrong, they are serious. And for this reason, I say that anti-discrimination law aims at the lobotomization of man. It aims to incapacitate our ability to draw distinctions between people, full stop. Now, why would a person do that? Because that is pretty crazy. Well, here's why they would do that. Suppose you're a good lefty egalitarian and you want nice equal distribution of resources. You've tried doing that through advocacy of redistribution of wealth, but us damn libertarians keep calling you thieves and muggers, and that's not going very well, and people can see they don't like this redistribution of wealth, so you come up with a much more insidious and honestly brilliant scheme. I must admit I am in awe of the people who put forward the anti-discrimination paradigm. I'm a huge fan in some ways, and at the same time regard them as hideously evil. They come up with this brilliant scheme that, well, we don't need to redistribute anything. If we can convince the population that the drawing of distinctions between people is immoral and irrational, egalitarianism takes care of itself. Okay? I've seen instances, for example, where a seller of goods is selling a good and the left-wing anti-discrimination people don't like that the price is apparently too high, and they say, well, this is economic discrimination. Okay? You are discriminating between a person who has the capacity and willingness to pay a large amount and someone who has not got the capacity or willingness to pay a large amount. Now, if you accept that that is an immoral distinction to draw, there goes the price system. There goes the idea of ownership of property, of the ability to exclude one person. If it is immoral for us to draw distinctions between people per se, then egalitarianism is achieved, not at a political level, but at a much deeper, fundamental, epistemological level. And so it is no accident that the kind of people that advocate this view tend to be people who are very much in favour of egalitarian redistribution of wealth. They have found a much more brilliant and insidious means of doing that, which is to convince people that the drawing of distinctions between different people on any grounds is immoral. And they are serious. The anti-discrimination paradigm and anti-discrimination laws is sometimes distinguished from instances of affirmative action. It shouldn't be. It is, in fact, a system of affirmative action in itself. And the reason for this is simple. If I make it illegal to discriminate on the grounds of sex, say, or race or age, people aren't going to admit they're doing that. Okay? I say, Walter, you, in my opinion, have engaged in race discrimination. You say, no, I never did such a thing. Well, I've got to prove this, or at least convince other people so that I can punish him, and the only way to do that is to look at the outcome of his decisions. Everything about whether he's actually discriminated is in his head. He knows if he did it, I don't. Okay? And so the only way I can show that as an evidentiary matter is to show that the outcomes that have occurred are incompatible with him having not discriminated. And that necessarily requires some counterfactual theory of what the kinds of breakdowns of representation of groups would look like in the absence of bad, immoral, nasty, prohibited discrimination. Now, as a matter of actual practice, anti-discrimination advocates have adopted the view that in the absence of bad discrimination, people would appear in all sorts of activities in proportion to their numbers in the population. Now, if we have 50% females and 50% males, then we'll have approximately 50% High Court judges being male and female, approximately 50% CEOs of companies being male and female, approximately 50% of nurses in hospitals being male or female. Okay, subject obviously to the allowable statistical variations that you expect from randomness, but fundamentally around that expected value. I've said before that there's no good reason to believe that should occur, and that's an entirely spurious judgment on their part. But even if they were to adopt a different counterfactual theory, they must have some counterfactual theory, whether it's proportional representation or something else, in order to demonstrate that Walter Block has discriminated in decision X when he denies it and all the evidence is in his head. I have to be able to point to a counterfactual theory and say, but hang on, of your graduate students, 7 out of 8 of them are males, all of them are white, all of them like economics. There's something funny going on here. All right? So I have to be able to point to some counterfactual theory and say this constitutes evidence that you have discriminated. Now, necessarily, that counterfactual theory therefore forms an implicit quota system of anti-discrimination law. Now, I'm a statistician. Statisticians are renowned for being witnesses in anti-discrimination cases. There's a great quote by a judge, I wish I'd brought it, and he says something like, anti-discrimination lawsuits tend to be competitions between college professors who revel in talking about statistical discourse. And they get guys like me to go in and analyse the racial and sex breakdown of a workforce and, you know, do chi-squared tests and all these wonderful statistical tests and say, you know, the probability that you would get this breakdown under this hypothesis is such and such, and wow, that's so low, surely he must have discriminated. All of that is predicated on the underlying assumption of equal proportional representation. All of the statistical tests applied in anti-discrimination cases test whether that underlying assumption is present in the particular workforce or whatever. Problem is, there is no reason to think that that should be the case. And so I'd say anti-discrimination law forms an implicit quota system. And it has the same effect as any more explicit quota system in affirmative action. Anti-discrimination law undermines the progress of victim groups. The way it does this is that if you are trying to obtain a good assessment of people's merit characteristics and you're discriminating on other grounds, or even if you're not discriminating on other grounds, but there's a correlation between merit characteristics and non-merit characteristics, you would expect unequal representation in various fields. So for example, if I'm an engineering firm and I want to hire a bunch of engineers, it's well known that there are just a lot more males in engineering than females. Now, whether that's due to a causal reason, or maybe females are just less interested in engineering, or whatever, there's just a lot less of them. I teach engineering students at university, the classes, there's many more males than females, that's true at most universities. And so if you're hiring on merits for engineers, you'll probably find that you will get more men, okay? Now, it's possible that maybe the women of the group are just so far ahead that you'll get equal numbers, but probably you'll end up with more men because there's more men coming in. Okay, and so we have a correlation between sex and the decision to, say, do an engineering degree. What that means is that if you want equal representation, if you want to go towards that kind of implicit quota system, or even if you just want to be close enough that you're within the statistically allowable boundaries so that no one's going to accuse you of unlawful discrimination, that means necessarily you're going to have to reduce the merits of the group you want more of. Okay? There are some other ways that you can nibble around the boundaries, and anti-discrimination activists have said things like, okay, well, one of the things you can do is just search more widely. You know, if you want more female engineers, just maybe send out more advertisements more widely looking for them, and maybe that'll help. Okay, maybe it will help, but maybe it won't be enough. And at some point, if the disparities are big enough, you may have to drop the standard if you want to bring equal representation in. Now, the big problem with that is that it undermines then the average merits across the groups. If everything was just done on merit to begin with, there would be unequal outcomes in the first instance, in the sense that there might be more male engineers at this firm than female engineers, but a guy coming in would have no reason to expect that the female engineers are any worse or better than the male engineers. Okay? Because if they were selected on their merits without regard to representational outcomes, I can go into the engineering firm, and if they give me the lady of the firm, I can go, okay, great. But if I know that they specifically tried to even the numbers up by dropping the merit standards, then suddenly I'm a little bit wary of these minority groups whose numbers are being pushed up, because I know that the decision process has been slanted in order to obtain that outcome. And so you get things like, for example, most people, I think you've probably heard of the idea of token minorities, that perhaps a firm might hire someone who's a minority despite the fact that they're not up to scratch in merit terms, just so they can get the nice photos to go on their CEO reports where, you know, it's a nice diverse crowd. Well, I really think that does undermine the victim groups that they're allegedly trying to help, because it creates new reasons for rational discrimination further down the chain that didn't exist before. And I think there's a lot of problems with that. It incentivises offence taking and grievances. This is probably one of the major features of anti-discrimination paradigm. Deborah Hellman, one of the advocates of the anti-discrimination paradigm, she's taken the view that rational discrimination should be prohibited because it is demeaning to people. I've said that I don't think that that's the case, that I don't think rational discrimination should be interpreted as demeaning, but she takes the view that it is. And she takes that view because she says, okay, if you engage in rational race discrimination as a taxi driver, then the young black guy who got turned down for a taxi cab, he's offended because he can't get a taxi cab. He's a nice guy, he's never hurt anyone. He feels it's demeaning to him because it's somehow implying that he's a criminal. I've said that I don't think that implication is present, but she argues that it is. What's interesting about that is that it makes the source of rights a person's emotional reaction to something. Instead of rationality being the source of rights and the application of reason being the source of rights, a person's rights is directly proportional to their capacity to take offence at things. That is a very, very dangerous view of rights. And obviously it incentivises the taking of offence and the manufacturing of grievances. And I don't think anyone who looks at the kind of anti-discrimination lobby can fail to see the degree to which there is just hypersensitivity, in some cases the most absurd expressions of offence taking, in some cases quite legitimate, but in other cases just utterly unbelievable. The most recent one I read literally a couple of days ago was a woman who is being sued for saying to someone, "You bloody Australian." Calling someone Australian now is a hate crime, apparently. I mean, this is just madness, that is offensive, or that should be the basis for a rights claim. Now, Hellman's philosophy here really invites this outcome, because she says, look, the fact that something's demeaning is the source of the fact that it should be prohibited and the source of someone's right for it not to happen. Therefore, great, if I want more rights, I just have to be more offended than I presently am. Okay? As IT people would say, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Okay? Usually we're used to looking at those kinds of situations and shaking our heads and rolling our eyes and saying, oh my goodness, the excesses of anti-discrimination law, this idiot saying that she's so offended because she was called an Australian. She was a New Zealander or something. It was terribly offensive. I'm sure she cries herself to sleep. But, I mean, this is not an aberration. This is not an abuse of the process. This is a direct result of making a person's rights proportional to their capacity to be offended by things. Anti-discrimination law fosters a misdiagnosis of racism. I've said that racism is a sufficient but not necessary condition for race discrimination. A lot of anti-discrimination activists and scholars themselves who disagree with me profoundly on everything else, nonetheless will quite happily admit that a lot of race discrimination is not predicated on racism, is predicated on those kinds of correlations that I've said before. But what the anti-discrimination lobby does is to try to portray every instance of race discrimination as racism, every instance of sex discrimination as sexism, and so on, and to try to link every kind of instance of discrimination with the worst kind of bigotry they can so that they can stamp it out. This obviously invites people to misdiagnose racism, to see more racism than there is. I'm not, by the way, saying that racism doesn't exist. I'm saying that if you adopt this kind of conflating of correlation and cause, you are bound to misdiagnose and get lots of false positives. That has two bad effects. Firstly, it makes the society you're in seem more racist than it really is. And secondly, it gives a free pass to people who actually are very bigoted and have very unreasonable views. Because if you start calling everyone a racist, really you're saying no one's a racist. And I think that's already starting to happen in some cases. So it fosters this misdiagnosis. And in my opinion, a corollary of this is that it encourages intergroup hate. Okay? If you're a young person, say you're a young black guy, and you're taught all through school and coming up and on the news and everything else that you should expect to be equally represented in everything. You should be able to expect to be equally likely to get a taxi cab as an 81-year-old lady in a walking frame. You have that expectation, and then it's smashed up against the rocks of reality. And you're told that's racism. They hate you. Okay? that I think does terrible things to a person's psyche. And it's not surprising to me that people who are inculcated with this kind of view, they see this and they feel like they're living in a society of people that hate them. And this really does encourage intergroup hate. And I think for that reason, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that these various anti-discrimination activist groups are hate groups. They are groups which feed off intergroup hate, feed off racial hate, sexual hate, intergroup conflict. They benefit from all of it, they foster all of it. And finally, as another corollary of that, because of setting up this irrational expectation, the anti-discrimination paradigm creates an insane obsession with race, sex, class, etc. as an explanatory theory for everything. And if you work in academia, you will know what I mean, or if you've been to law school, you will know what I mean. This becomes the overarching explanation for everything. And again, this follows from the fact that the incorrect expectation of equal representation, when that's not satisfied by looking at actual processes in reality, people look to race, sex, etc. as the sole explanatory mechanism for all of this. There's plenty more I could say, but I think I'm going to go over time otherwise. So I'll open up to questions.
We have time for one or two questions.
Thanks, Ben. That was excellent. Are you aware, and can you comment on, the Australian Anti-Discrimination Group that's working with the federal government on political discrimination, on your political beliefs? And if you offend someone, they're actually planning to reverse the onus of proof on the accused to prove their innocence.
Yeah, I don't think that's new, that reversal of the onus of proof. I mean, I think the actual mechanics of anti-discrimination law are very worrying from a legal perspective. It tends to be enforced through tribunals, executive tribunals that are not subject to the same kinds of standards of proof and evidence as as courts. It's enforced in large part through tribunals with members appointed by the executive government. Often it's stacked very much with anti-discrimination activists or ex-anti-discrimination, older ones that have proven themselves in the human rights tribunals and so on, and who are now tribunal members. And there are a lot of worrying things. There are things, for example, depending on the particular tribunal, sometimes an accused is not allowed legal representation necessarily. Sometimes they're denied the ability to cross-examine their accuser. Again, this varies. There's a lot of very worrying legal aspects of it. I mean, that's even a separate consideration to what I've been talking about, but there's other things that are pretty horrible.
All right, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Would you please join me in thanking Dr. Brown?